In this lecture, we're going to learn how to import a component for a route dynamically. I want to start discussing bundle size reduction techniques. Let's talk about the idea of a bundle. Every time a file was updated, Vite would update our bundle. A bundle contains our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code. The bundle size can get quite large the more logic and libraries we add into the mix. There's even a phrase for being afraid of how large your bundle can get called bundle phobia. It can be easy to let your bundle grow to a large size during the development phase of your application. The source directory is relatively small compared to the modules directory. A lot of the optimizations will be for the modules we're using. However, that doesn't mean you shouldn't also optimize the code in the source directory. In this and the next few lectures, we'll look at how we can reduce the bundle size. One of the simplest things we can do is to dynamically import route components. If I'm on the home page, it is only necessary to load the home component file. By default, all components get loaded, whether they're being used or not. That's not an effective way to load things. It would be better if we could load components when they're needed. We can use dynamic loading to get the desired result. We can instruct Vite to put components into separate files. Then when they're needed, they can be loaded in and still work. This feature is referred to as chunks by the Vite community. Chunks are a Vite concept. They're not specific to Vue, but still important to know. The files in your project are combined into a single file, or at least that's what Vite tries to do. Sometimes you may not want this to be the case. We can tell Vite that we'd like for a file to be processed, but not be part of the core bundle. This is what's called a chunk. Chunks are ideal for files that are requested to make your app functional but don't need to be loaded immediately. Instead, they can be loaded at a later time. Vite will handle separating files for your application. When you need them, it'll help you with this process too. Creating a chunk isn't hard. One of the most common methods of using chunks is for loading route components. I'm currently in the router file. Inside this file, we are importing the components for the routes. We need to do this because the router requires us to register the components in the records. We're going to instruct Vite to convert these components into chunks. This will allow our application to load the components only when they're needed. We can load the components asynchronously. Vite will help us with that. Below the import statements, we're going to create a variable called home. The value for this variable will be an arrow function. We're not going to immediately import the component. Instead, we'll create a function that can be called for importing the component. The return value of this function should be the component we want to dynamically load. We're going to call the import function. The import keyword may be used as a function to import a module dynamically. The data exported by a module will be returned as the value. The import function requires the path to the module we want to import. We'll pass in the path to the home component file. After adding this in, we can safely remove the import statement above. Let me break down the process Vite will go through to import these files. It'll notice that we're using the import function. The file you pass in will be made into a chunk automatically. When the import function is called, it'll load the chunk for us. It's taken care of for us behind the scenes. We don't need to update the route because we used the same identifier from the import statement. Route records will accept functions as long as the function we're passing in will return the component configuration object. If the home route is visited, the Vue router will invoke the home function we created. The home function will call the import function, which will proceed to load the chunk file. I'm going to do the same for the rest of the components. I've removed the import statements for the components. Make sure you do that as well. Once you've made those changes, save your work. Then view the app in the browser. The app is functioning fine. we can switch between pages without a problem. To better understand what's going on behind the scenes, we'll open the Developer Tools Network panel. In the Developer Tools, we're going to filter the results by JavaScript. Chunks are saved as JavaScript files. I'll refresh the page and switch to the About page from the Home page. A new request was logged. The request is for the chunk generated by Vite. It'll hold the component data. That's great. This will reduce the bundle size by not including code the user doesn't need immediately. What's even better is that if a chunk has already been loaded, Vite will not load the same chunk again. This makes switching between pages faster. The chunk gets temporarily cached. That wraps it up for this lecture. We'll continue in the next one.